Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the National Center for Civil and Human Rights today. My name is Cam Argetsinger, and I am the Senior Manager of Public Engagement at the Center. And today we are going to talk about what does defund the police actually mean. And the reason we're talking about this is the recent murders of unarmed Black men and women, including Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and here in Atlanta, Rayshard Brooks, and the frustration that is felt in communities of color regarding police violence around Black people has led not to just calls for justice and prosecution of police officers, but calls to defund and abolish the police. Today, this program will explore the history of policing, how public opinion of the police is changing, and what defunding the police actually means and how this would affect our communities. And to help us lead this today is our moderator, Kiplyn Primus. And she is the, back to full screen, apologize. And she is the host of The Local Take with Kiplyn Primus, heard on Saturday mornings at 7 a.m. on WCLK. She also works with local businesses and organizations interested in paid underwriting schedules on Atlanta Jazz Public Radio Station. Kiplyn Primus is also a graduate of Howard University and Clark Atlanta University and has a long career in public and commercial media. She is a veteran facilitator for StoryCorps Atlanta Studio and has written extensively on global and local initiatives for a number of publications. So Kiplyn, welcome, and thank you so much for agreeing to be our moderator today.
Well, Cam, I was glad to get the invitation, and this seems like a very timely discussion for our community to be having. And what better place to facilitate that than the National Center for Civil and Human Rights? So I'm glad to be a part of today's conversation, and I'd like to welcome our panelists. And first we have Jesse Kelley. Okay, and Jesse is the Manager of Government Affairs and Manager of Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at R Street Institute, which is an organization that supports and researches criminal justice and civil liberties policies. Jesse works with lawmakers to implement effective public policies relating to police reform, juvenile justice, post-conviction life, and other related topics. Jesse has a bachelor's degree in English literature from Troy University and a Juris Doctor from University of Mississippi with a concentration in international law from Cambridge University. Jesse, welcome.
Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
And next we have Alex Vitale. And Alex is a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. He studies policing. He has spent the last 25 years writing about policing. He consults with police departments and human rights organizations and serves as an advisor on the New York State Advisory Committee and of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Professor Vitale is the author of City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life campaign transformed New York politics, and The End of Policing, which I have been recommending to various people to read. So I'm glad to be able to speak with Professor Vitale this morning. Professor Vitale, welcome.
Thank you, and it's Vitale.
Vitale, thank you so much.
You bet.
And next on our panel is Devin Barrington. Devin is a young futurist. He has a vision for the future that's grounded in his experience as a Black queer man of Caribbean descent. Since the age of 16, he's been working to transform and empower Black and Brown communities and other marginalized groups to address current and future barriers to good health, justice, collective safety, and freedom. He got his start working as a staffer on the Stacey Abrams 2006 campaign for the Georgia State House of Representatives. Devin Barrington, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being a part of this timely and important discussion. I'm excited to get into it because the time is always right for justice.
Well, I would like for us to start with the history. Professor Vitale, can you give us an idea about what the history of policing has looked like in our country and how it has changed over the years?
You bet. We have this idea that, well, we've always had police and they've always looked like what we have today. And this actually isn't true. Most cities in the United States have only had police forces for about 150 years. And we also have this assumption that policing has always just existed to kind of neutrally enforce the law in a way that's automatically beneficial for everyone. And this just really isn't true. The earliest modern professional civilian police force in the United States was the Charleston City Watch and Guard, created in the late 1700s. They had uniforms and badges and were civilians and enforced the law, but the primary law that they were enforcing was the law of slavery. They were in charge of managing what was a huge mobile slave population that worked outside of the home of their owners on the wharves, in warehouses, unloading ships, things like that. So this history of policing has actually mostly been a story about enforcing a legal system that has reproduced race and class inequality in the United States. The first state police force in the United States was the Pennsylvania State Police, created a little bit after 1900, and their primary mission was to suppress the workers' movements in the coal and iron fields of rural Pennsylvania. So this was not a tool that was there to benefit everyone. And out west, the early police forces were created primarily, like the Texas Rangers, to facilitate the clearing of lands of indigenous peoples and folks who had come from Spain and Mexico to make way for white settlement. And today we can still see police playing a similar role in reproducing inequality, even through the seemingly neutral enforcement of the law. And we can see this most clearly with the war on drugs that has unleashed a massive amount of policing on the already most vulnerable communities in our society, because wealthier, whiter communities don't rely on police to deal with their problems. They have access to resources that allow them to treat these problems through the medical system or counseling. So we always have to ask ourselves, why has a particular problem historically and today been turned over to the police to manage, and what could the alternative look like?
And what you're actually describing is the culture of policing and how the culture started and how the culture actually continues today. Jesse, could you share a little bit about changing and reform in police policy over the years?
Yes, thank you. So for purposes of our conversation today, I think it's important that we examine the past 25 years of policing policies to understand the dynamic shifts in policing that have led us to today. So in 1994, the law enforcement community had just endured what was, at the time, the most widespread and damaging scandal, the videotaped arrest of Rodney King by LAPD officers. 1994 was also the year that Congress passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which, among many other things, that crime bill included a provision allowing federal investigation of local law enforcement agencies alleged to engage in a pattern of excessive force or racial discrimination. Since then, the Department of Justice has initiated over 70 investigations, with many resulting in powerful consent decrees overseen by federal courts and independent moderators. Since 1994, the policing profession has changed due to advancing technology, increased access to military weapons, and a lack of effective recruiting and training techniques. So the widespread use of technology has played a significant role in changing the way officers police communities. Officers surrounded by sources of real-time information from in-car computers to other mobile devices, and Detectives have access to varied sources of data from surveillance video to social media, license plate readers, GPS transponders, and cell tower communications. Currently, the use and the call for the increased use of both in-car and body-worn cameras is providing courts and communities with a look into a police officer's duties with the goal of adding increased responsibility for each officer. While all the technology is advancing, weaponry is also progressing, and local police departments have been given access to military-grade tools like tanks and more sophisticated guns. The charge to protect and serve has slowly been shifting to a more militaristic call to attack and destroy, pitting communities against police rather than supporting a shared approach towards the unifying goal of public safety. Finally, nearly every law enforcement organization in the country right now is struggling to acquire and maintain competent police officers. Moving forward, it will be critical to reform recruiting and training methods to ensure that they are enacting police reforms and they'll truly take hold at a local level.
Police reform, but we've been reforming the police for a long time, it seems. So Devin, you're here to talk about some specific policy in policing that has taken place in Atlanta over the years. Can you share?
Well, first, I want to talk a little bit about my history. One, growing up in the South, I was confronted with police violence at a very early age. At 6, I saw my father beat up by DeKalb County Police at South DeKalb Mall while I was trying to get glasses. And I remember the horror of seeing 8 police officers jump on top of my father, who is not much bigger than I am. We're about 5'7", we're short men. But we're tall in character. And seeing him assaulted in that way at an early age definitely influenced my outlook on law enforcement. I go back to when I was in high school in 2006, I was a member of the speech and debate team. And one of the issues that I took to our national debate competition was the elimination of no-knock warrants, because at the time, Katherine Johnston, a 92-year-old grandmother, was gunned down in her home as she took a stand and shot back, but was gunned down by her home by officers who had used a no-knock warrant but went to the wrong address. And I am disappointed that through all the reform, now in 2020, we saw the killing of Breonna Taylor. She was murdered actually on my 30th birthday, March 13th. And so I was having a conversation with my grandmother, who is in her 80s. And as we were talking, my family is from the Caribbean, they're Jamaican and from Trinidad. And she talked about how when she first came to the country, and she remembered when she was coming down from upstate New York, and she saw protesters being hosed down in the streets of Harlem, Black protesters, after the killing of Dr. King. I was arrested in 2018 after standing up against voter suppression in the state of Georgia after the thievery of the 2018 elections. I bring all of those experiences to those conversations because my experience as a Black man who is only 30 years old is that the efforts to reform the police have fundamentally failed, because I still don't feel safe. I was 4 or 5 when Rodney King was assaulted by LA police officers. I was 16 when Katherine Johnston was killed by Atlanta police officers in a no-knock warrant. And I'm 30 years old and I'm seeing these same events take place over and over again. And so the reform is not working, and that is why many of us are calling for the defunding and the dismantling of policing as we know it in this country, because it doesn't work. The reforming has not worked. And so that is why we need a different approach. And as the professor spoke to, that many of us are calling on what we see in other communities that do not see these large levels of policing, which is investment in people, investment in community, and a recognition that safety starts with the people and not the police.
Safety starts with the people and not the police. And now we've been hearing this term, defund the police. We've been hearing disband the police. And I'm not sure, the differences, but I think what really needs to be done is a reorder, because it is not the police, it is the culture of policing. And as Professor Vitale explained, it's the culture started with keeping poor, Black, brown, and Asian people in the West down. It was started to oppress people who did not have power. That is how the police started in this country. And no matter what you do with reform, that culture stands. No matter what reform comes through, no matter how many different laws, that culture stands. And we see that in the officer who put a young man in a chokehold just a week ago, after all of the conversation about getting rid of police chokeholds. In New York, I think chokeholds were outlawed in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken.
And
I
Eric
think
Garner
it
was killed in 2016.
So reform doesn't seem to work. Professor Vitale, why do you think defunding may be different than reforming, that it might be actually something that provides change?
I think it's so important to think about this movement that we're in right now as a public safety movement. The police have not kept so many people in our community safe at times that they needed help. And if you look at the people really leading this movement, they're people who have experienced profound lack of safety in their lives. And for them, police were just another form of unsafety. And so what they're demanding is that government rethink its priorities, that we quit turning every social problem and every problem of a lack of safety over to the police to manage. Exactly because the historical legacy of policing has not really been to serve the interests of vulnerable communities, those who've been left out, those who've been left on their own. And so they're calling for new investments in specific targeted programs that they think will actually make their communities safer than the system we have right now. And it includes everything from domestic violence to people having a mental health crisis, to conflicts between young people, to dealing with mass homelessness. And it's about a process of going to budget hearings and lobbying city council members and trying to get our local budget priorities to better match the real needs of communities who are crying out for more safety.
And this would be an opportunity to move away from the militaristic and the punitive police force to a police force that does actually protect and serve. And so, Jesse, in our street's history of researching this, have you found occasions where reform actually made a difference and made a change? And I know a lot of people have talked about the Camden, New Jersey model, but is there any other place, or how did the Camden, New Jersey model work? What does your research show?
That's a great question. Our street now is engaging in this questionnaire, if you will, with police officers very directly. We're looking at 3 cities, LA, Montgomery, Alabama, and Miami, Florida, and we're taking rides with both rookies, those police officers who are in their first year, and field training officers, the older, supposed to be more experienced officer that will lead that cadet to be ready to protect and serve the public. And what we're finding is that all of those officers we're directly talking to are completely fine with being perceived as more militaristic, even though they know the public is seeing them as more assertive. And that's a real issue. So when we talk about reform and what's working in reform, I think that the system is broken from the very start, right? We're bringing in the wrong types of people to become police. And part of this defund the police movement, I think, is to move some of the funds to other areas and avenues, and part of that should be spent on recruiting the best people for all different types of work. Not every person who's signing up to be a police officer should be. And I think that that's a critical first step. And you mentioned Camden, New Jersey, but what else is happening very currently is on June 7th, the city council in Minneapolis announced its intent to disband the city's police department with a veto-proof majority and replace it with a holistic model of public safety that will actually keep that community safe. So our street does spend a lot of time too talking about this militarization aspect, and we think that is a very real problem. There's actually legislation on Capitol Hill right now to remove some of the mechanisms to transfer those military-grade weapons down to local police departments. But just to give you an example of how rampant that problem is, since 2006, police departments have procured over 400 armored vehicles, over 500 military aircrafts, and over 90,000 machine guns. So there's a problem coming in from all different areas, and really redistributing funding is going to be the way to fix things.
And so we've all heard about, defunding housing. Affordable housing is pretty much no longer available through state or county resources. We all know about defunding education, where teachers every summer and fall are buying pens and paper and crayons and all the things that they need. Why is the message of defunding the police, why does that seem so unpalatable to so many of our citizens, but we're living with the effects of defunding education is why policing is what it is. How can we make that correlation so that citizens understand exactly what defund means and are not scared from that process? And I don't know, Devin or Professor Vitale?
Well, I think one of it, there was so much great information that was shared by my two other panelists. Thank you. One of the things is that we've got to talk about, the fact that in America, we celebrate police. If we look at, you can binge watch any Criminal Minds, Law and Order, SVU, CSI that portrays cops, the police system in this way where they are always heralded as the hero, they're always heralded as the good guy, they're always heralded as, those that are standing up for our rights and people in terms of their public servants. But we know that, what we see on TV is not necessarily the reality of policing in our communities, particularly if you are in a Black or Brown community. When we talk about and so that culture protects people and protects the police specifically because it always is viewed as the police being the heroes. And we don't necessarily tell the real story of what police actually engage in and the harm that they actually cause in many communities. When we talk about, the aspect, I see a question that came up in the chat, how do you, kind of reframe the conversation around police when older whites, and let's be frank, older Black people, right? Older Black people, particularly in more affluent neighborhoods, like if we're talking about the city of Atlanta, older Black people in Cascade are going to have a very different perspective on policing in their neighborhoods versus, me as a younger Black person that lives in Bankhead. And so we also have to talk about how privilege and the idea that people are coming to take what I have. And so the police oftentimes are used to protect white property and white lives, right? And then there's a spectrum of what is in closer connection to that white property and white lives. So if it is a Black homeowner that lives in a home that looks like it could be on the north side of town where white folks live, then it is assumed that that is more valuable of protecting than a Black life, than neighborhoods in Bankhead, neighborhoods in other areas of the city, like Katherine Johnson's neighborhood, where they would, use a no-knock warrant, but maybe be more hesitant than using a no-knock warrant in Alpharetta or another side of town. So it's also about the proximity to whiteness and the proximity to power that also shifts and views our relationships with the police. More specifically here in Atlanta, we have, myself with Black Futurist Group, Women on the Rise, another organization led by formerly incarcerated folks, Racial Justice Action Center and Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative, have been engaging the city on defunding the carceral state, which is also connected to policing. And so we were successful in being able to push the mayor to create a task force to close and repurpose the Atlanta Detention Center. And since then, we have reduced the budget of the city jail from $32.5 million to about $3.5 million. And we've also reduced the population from about 750 people just about 2 years ago to less than about 10 people on average at the jail. What we've been able to do with that is retool those dollars into supporting alternative responses. So Atlanta Fulton pre-arrest diversion, that is an alternative responder model that allows for police officers to call a caseworker or community members to call a caseworker that can come out to triage a situation that may be grounded in poverty, that may be grounded in substance abuse, that may be grounded in some sort of unaddressed mental health need, instead of a prison cell. That is why we are talking about defunding the police, because through defunding the police, we can reimagine public safety in our city and across the country. Atlanta had the opportunity to do that last week, and we still have the opportunity to do that, but there were council members that did not have the courage to vote to withhold, not actually take away, but just put half of the police department's budget in a lockbox so that we could be under the pressure needed to reimagine public safety in the city of Atlanta. And so that is why many folks are leading those efforts, because we know that Atlanta pre-arrest diversion works. We know that alternative responses to first responders that does not require someone with a badge or a gun works. Why are we sending out a police officer for truant students? And we also have to recognize that weapons, badges, and many of the equipment that you all talked about that are being donated to local law enforcement escalate situations. Immediately, it is escalated when someone shows up with a gun. The situation is escalated when protesters are met with tanks. And so I think we have to keep all of those things into context, but it does first start with the culture. And in America, we love to celebrate the cop.
Yeah, if I could jump in really quickly here, thank you. I want to piggyback off what you said about talking about young people, especially those young people who may be truant from school. This is only increasing that school to prison pipeline, and it's completely in opposition of giving those young people the opportunity for an education. And in my view, the big problem here is that we have school resource officers rather than social workers and counselors. So simply changing that stream of funding to have access to mental health and help talking through problems in a school, rather than just immediately funneling kids who may be acting out for separate reasons into the juvenile justice system. Like that is a simple funding change that makes a lot of sense and would make our entire community safer and would provide a better future for those young people who are being directly impacted.
So for people who really don't understand what defund means, and we've got, some questions in the audience, defund doesn't sound like reimagine. So, defund, and as we mentioned in Minneapolis, they just disbanded. And Professor Vitale, you have a book, The End of Policing. I don't know how to explain it to the general populace that this doesn't mean that, if someone pulls a gun on them, that there isn't a police officer that'll show up. But as Devin mentioned, if it's a truant kid, you don't need a police officer to show up. The other thing that was mentioned is the escalation of things. In almost all of these videos, it is the police who escalate the situation. And this is from 11-year-old girls in a school environment where we've seen the child saying, why aren't police taught if someone says, let me go, let them go. I mean, it was an 11-year-old on a school campus. Mr. Brooks here in Atlanta, they had his car, they had his license. Where was he going? Why did it matter for him to keep going? So I don't know how to explain this to the layman or to the general populace. And speaking of African Americans, in the 5th District of Atlanta, that's three strikes outlaw passed majority of the voters. African Americans want safe policing, We just don't want to be killed for it. So what is there's a wide gap between safe policing and being killed because you fell asleep in a drive-through. How do we get there?
So, part of the problem is that for the last 40 years or so, we've been told the only tool we can have to create safety for ourselves is more police and more prisons. And I think, when we listen to folks like Devin who are in communities who've experienced this policing firsthand, we see the direct limits to that strategy. But also, as Devin pointed out, there are a lot of people who benefit from this system, for whom policing is a shortcut to maintaining a status quo that they've done very well with. And so, just as when we look back on the 1960s, where so many of the uprising and riots were triggered by policing, we don't think today that those were just about policing, right? That was about a broader issue of racial justice. And I think that's how we have to understand the moment we're in right now as well. It's not just about a few procedural tweaks to policing so that they kill a slightly fewer number of people. First of all, those procedural tweaks have done nothing to reduce the number of killings, nothing. And secondly, it does nothing to address these problems of racial and economic justice in our society. And these things are linked. Every dollar we put into policing is a dollar we can't have to strengthen communities, to lift individuals up instead of tearing them down. But also, every dollar we put into policing is enabling an ideology, a worldview that says the appropriate way to solve problems for those people, right, is through force, through threats, violence, and coercion. And so we need to re-articulate a different vision of justice that is about making communities whole, making them resilient, making them strong. And policing is antithetical to that. Right. And that's really the challenge before us.
Well, I was just going to say, we know in most communities, we're spending more money on locking people up than we are on education. In Georgia, I think it's close to $50,000. And what's worse, you're locking up a person for $50,000. You're paying a guard $30,000 to watch them. In California, it's even worse. They pay between $75,000 and $80,000 to lock up prisoners. Every state is spending more money to lock people up than they're spending on education. How did we get into this paradigm? And Devin, I'm sure you're aware of this. In any community, that's not a privileged community in any state.
Yeah, I think one of the things, you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute talks about how we spend about $4.8 billion in Georgia on police, prisons, and jails. We have another $89 million worth of overstocked or surplus military equipment that has been gifted to local law enforcement. And we've increased our spending on police, prisons, and jails over the last 40 years by 122%, while we've decreased our spending in that same time frame on low-income families by 81%. And so, but the other thing that is so interesting and really angers me is that you can't have it both ways. You can't on one side, mayor, police chief, city council members brag about how crime in Atlanta is down and has been down for years. So why are we spending more money on police? Why did we see a $12.5 million increase in the budget for APD when Atlanta has one of the highest per capita ratings of police officers per resident? We're like as far as US cities, I believe we are number 17 out of cities that have the highest levels of police officers in comparison to the numbers of residents. And so what we don't see going up, we see crime has not gone up, but what has gone up is HIV. We haven't invested any money in our HIV housing program. Our HIV rates rivals some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Yet we continue to put more money into policing and jails and not money into very clear pandemics that are impacting Black and brown people before COVID-19. We know that the rates of homelessness have gone up for particular communities, particularly homeless families, people sleeping in their cars or oftentimes being housing insecure. We know that that has gone up. We know that the education gap continues to widen, but we continue to not invest money in the areas where we see the disparities. But when we see that crime is going down, we continue to invest more and more in police. It just doesn't make sense. Dr. King talked about one of the things that really annoys me here in the city of Atlanta is that we love to quote Dr. King and other civil rights leaders. But I've told folks out in the streets, do not allow these city leaders to pacify you with watered down quotations from Dr. King and other civil rights leaders. Because if we looked at the People's Campaign, the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, Dr. King is very clear about the need for budgets to reflect the priority of justice. That if we really want to achieve justice, if we really want to achieve liberation, if we really want to achieve equity in communities, then we must see local budgets from governments and state budgets from governments and federal budgets that reflect a commitment to dismantling injustice and a commitment towards securing justice. And we don't see that. The last thing that I will say is that a lot of folks kind of talk about, well, there's a messaging issue around this narrative of defunding the police. What I will say to that is that you have to start from, there has to be a start point. You have to start from A, B, and then get to C. Starting at A is the defunding. And in Atlanta, what was proposed by the city council was not an entire defund. Make it clear, it was a hold, so that there would be, because if there is no incentive for council members to do the work and put their nose to the ground, and for the administration to do the work and put their nose to the ground, then we will continue to see this issue languish, and there will be another Rayshard Brooks, there will be another Katherine Johnston, there will be another Oscar Kane, there will be another Jimmy Atkinson, there will be another Alexia Christian, and the other names that Atlanta has on its ledger of death. And so it is really important that we do start with the defunding, because you cannot reimagine until we withhold those funds and say, hey, we're not going to secure the rest of this budget until we have a new path forward for how in January 2021 that we aren't starting with the same type of public safety system in the city of Atlanta that we did last year. And the only way to do that is through the power of the purse string.
I agree. And I know it's not an easy message for some people to take, but I think we've just got to figure out a way to make it more palatable. One of the questions that has come up in the chat from Brene Bradley is about police unions. Police unions is one of the strongest unions in state politics. How do we address the police unions? And that's been one of the reasons that reform is hard to take root, is because the unions are still there on behalf of the police officers in a way that most unions cannot work on behalf of their members.
Just quickly, if I may, two things. One, I've met with multiple police chiefs in Washington, D.C. and here in the city of Atlanta, and they all talk about how police unions prevent them from being able to take bad officers off of the street because they go into arbitration and they aren't just held to the same, at work rights that most Georgians are. Georgia, for example, is a right to work state. Police officers, because of their unions, are oftentimes exempt from that. One of the things that I would call on is larger labor unions that oftentimes align themselves on the issues of racial justice, like SEIU and others, and the AFL-CIO and others that claim to be supportive of racial justice movements. It is time to remove police unions from those broader unions like the AFL-CIO, like SEIU, and others that have a history of aligning themselves with racial justice movements, but you cannot be fully aligned if we continue to support this dangerous system of policing.
Professor Vitale, is that part of it? I'm reminded of the quote, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And police there's no no accountability. And you know, even former police in the Ahmaud Arbery case, he was a former police officer. But most police officers, there's no accountability. So when you don't have any accountability and you have a history of everyone getting away with whatever they want, unless of course there's an Asian cop or an African American cop, because quite often those officers do go to jail. What is it with the unions? How can we fight when the unions are so strong?
Well, I certainly agree with Devin that they don't belong in our labor movement. I'm a fourth generation union member, and I'm not in the business of breaking unions, but I do, because I think that will just come back to haunt the rest of the labor movement. But I do think that we need to intervene in the political power that these unions have, because when we look at these sort of agreements in the collective bargaining agreements that give them so much insulation from accountability, those agreements have been signed by local mayors and city councils. The police don't just unilaterally impose these things. They use campaign contributions and get out the vote efforts and endorsements to pressure politicians to give them carte blanche. And so what I think we need to be doing is we need to find out who are the politicians who are taking those endorsements and that campaign money. And we have to make those endorsements and campaign money politically toxic to them. And this is actually going on around the country. There's a growing list of elected officials who just in the last month have rejected these endorsements and campaign contributions. In fact, many have gone back and looked at their campaign records, pulled out the funds from police unions and turned them over to bail funds and mutual aid projects, and said that they no longer want to have that kind of relationship to those unions. And I think that's essential.
To piggyback off that really briefly, I think that it's important to look too at prosecutors who are running for office, who are receiving funds from police unions, but also in Missouri, maybe 18 months ago, 2 years, assistant district attorneys were attempting to join police unions. There must be a difference there. I practiced law, criminal defense in Alabama for a number of years, and seeing the police and the prosecutors be in cahoots feels like the entire system is mounted against you and your client. It is an unsurmountable hill. And until we stop the collaboration between prosecutors and police officers, we're going to continue to see this systemic racism and real problems throughout our criminal justice system, not just in policing.
Locally, where there's an example of that just really quickly is in the prosecution of these two police officers that were involved in the death of Rayshard Brooks. We recognize, and I have had my issues with District Attorney Paul Howard, and he knows that. We are on the task force to close and repurpose the Atlanta City Detention Center. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that folks don't recognize that the district attorney's office has investigationary authority. So the idea that Paul Howard has to wait for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to move forward with the case, that is not how this works. They serve as an additional entity on police-involved shootings, but ultimately any felony shooting, any felony murder case still falls under the jurisdiction of the district attorney, who has their own office of investigators and are allowed to move forward with the case as they so see forward, because they are constitutionally elected. And so while there are some muddying of him running for re-election and a primary that is contested and a runoff race and all of the things, we also have to recognize that District Attorney Howard's office should have been doing this. But what happened was there was public unrest that required for elected officials. He listened to the people in the street saying enough is enough. There was a quick question in there about surveillance. And I'm sure Jesse maybe has more on this, but I would just quickly say, we saw Eric Garner get choked out on TV. We saw Philando Castile die on Facebook Live. We've seen the video footage. We've seen body cameras. We saw the young, the man in South Carolina who was killed. in a similar way of Rayshard Brooks.
Shot in the back.
Shot in the back as they were running away. We see these things on film and nothing changes. And so oftentimes there's a lot of concern, particularly in the activist community, that the body cameras and the scanners on the back of vehicles and all of the cameras are not necessarily used to slow down police or actually give them less aggression, but what it actually is used is to observe people who want to hold the police accountable. And so I have hesitancy around surveillance because I believe that the surveillance is not used to hold police accountable, but it is further used to over-criminalize and over-police the very communities it is supposed to be aimed at protecting. And so that is why many of us do not feel like President Obama's 21st Century Policing Act is the path forward, because it did rely a lot on body cameras. And we saw the body camera footage of what happened to Rayshard Brooks, and that didn't hesitate. And actually the body camera fell off. So we didn't even get to see fell off or was pushed off. We didn't even get to see the full entirety of what happened. And if it wasn't for the Wendy's camera, and if it wasn't for eyewitness accounts, who knows the narrative that would have been painted around Rayshard Brooks and what happened.
Well, we do know that there are some laws up. I think the House just passed a bill that is not looking good for passage in the Senate, but they did. That's the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, Ending Qualified Immunity Act, Count to Cut the Crimes Act. Devin has mentioned other courts, preliminary courts or mediation courts. What is the answer? Professor Vitale, I'm going to start with you because your book, In Policing, does provide some answers. But I would like for everyone, what is the answer? What do we need to pay attention to that's going on now? What bills can we get behind?
Well, policing in the United States is primarily a local matter. There are some things the feds can do. They can roll back Operation Relentless Pursuit. They could end the federal war on drugs. They could dial back our reliance on ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. They could quit transferring military weaponry. They could quit subsidizing school policing. But at the local level, this is about really developing specific, targeted, community-based interventions that are going to make people safer than relying on armed police. That means actually creating community-based mental health services and a 24-hour crisis response capacity that's staffed by medical professionals and outreach workers, not armed police. It's about returning those counselors and social workers to schools that was mentioned before. It's about investing in community-based anti-violence efforts to address things like domestic violence and youth violence. It's about providing supports for families. It's about creating prevention initiatives instead of waiting for police to come and take a report after the damage has already been done. That doesn't really create the kind of safety that people are looking for. This idea that, well, we call, someone's breaking in, so we called 911 and then that fixed everything. That's not what happens. First of all, many people won't call 911 because they view the police as a source of danger. And second, the police always arrive after the fact, take a report that's often not even investigated, much less solved.
Jesse?
Thanks. One thing.
Answer is.
Yeah, one thing that we haven't been able to talk a lot about today is ending or strictly limiting qualified immunity. So courts have interpreted qualified immunity to bar individuals recovering damages when a law enforcement officer has violated their constitutional rights. And while some believe that qualified immunity is necessary for police officers to be able to do their job and, that it protects officers who are forced to make split-second decisions, it also removes entirely too much responsibility for their own actions. So ending or strictly limiting qualified immunity would ideally prompt those officers to take more care when using force, are making discretionary decisions. And we've seen sort of two buckets of movement on that right now. On Capitol Hill, there are two bills that are being reviewed, the Ending Qualified Immunity Act and the Reforming Qualified Immunity Act. Both of those are still alive, even though you were right, there's a little bit of a stalemate with the Justice and Policing Act moving forward. We've also seen state governments take steps. Last week in Colorado, Governor Paulus signed a bill that would allow for an individual to be held responsible, a police officer, for up to $25,000 when they violate someone's civil rights. So I agree with Alex that state and local governments and officers picking up this mantle is certainly going to be a critical point moving forward.
And Devin, what do you think the ultimate answer is, and what laws and remedies are you following in the process currently?
Yeah, so I believe it is the defunding and the dismantling of our local police department here in the city of Atlanta and the reimagining of public safety. And if you all, I will put it in the chat, blackfuturistgroup.com, blackfuturistgroup.com. At the top on the navigation bar, you will see our demands that set out a very clear pathway for how we would go about reimagining public safety. And those demands are supported by the Georgia NAACP. Those demands are supported by Black Futurist Group and Women on the Rise, Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative, and several other social justice and community-based organizations. What we see here in Atlanta is that we need to send a very clear message, and the message isn't incremental reforms. We saw 6 police officers drag 2 innocent college students on film out of the car, tase them, use batons, all of the things. And then less than a week later, 2 police officers shot Rayshard Brooks. So obviously the message of accountability is not getting through to the people who are patrolling our streets. Because at the time, the police chief sent a memo that was leaked to the public that she felt as though the charges against the officers who were involved in that incident were political in nature. And so what it did was sent a signal that we can continue to do business as usual because the top brass doesn't care. And then what did happen? Rayshard Brooks was dead in a parking lot. And so folks, you have to ask yourself some really fundamental questions as well. This also starts personally. When is the last time you felt like the police or the justice system actually secured you justice? I know anytime that I've called 911 for a broken window and stolen property, I've never received that property back. I got a police report and I was told to go to my insurance company and figure it out from there. So if that was the case, why did someone with a badge and a gun need to show up to my house to do that? When is the last time, I think it was really important, one of our partners, Tony Michelle with Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative, a Black trans woman. Trans women are killed at rates that are extremely disproportionate in this country, despite oftentimes being on the front lines for freedom. But one of the things that you never hear Black trans women talk about is we need more police, because they recognize that the police oftentimes put them in situations where they are more endangered in the first place, particularly if they are engaging in survival sex work because they are denied opportunities for upward mobility. And so they have a double target on their back where the police can now engage and harass them. And if we look at the rates of sexual violence.
I think we may have a glitch for Devin. But one of the other things I wanted to say, there's a question in our chat about private prisons. And I mentioned how much it costs for some states to lock up people. California would probably do better paying the Black and brown people that they lock up the $70,000 a year. And imagine the innovation that would come out of people not being stressed out about how to pay for their housing and how to feed their family. So that would be better than locking people up, is to pay them that money and you'd have a better outcome. But
Absolutely.
We are in this situation of private prisons, and then someone is asking about quotas. Are these parts of the policing conundrum that also need to be solved?
Absolutely. Am I back? Are you able to hear
Yes,
me?
you're back.
Okay, absolutely. You know, in Atlanta, before we started with defunding the efforts to defund the police, we started with defunding the jail. And so we were able to target a jail that didn't hold people on misdemeanor charges, that didn't hold people on felony charges. Nobody at the city jail has ever been there because they murdered someone, raped someone, maimed someone. They were there for quality of life policing violations, city ordinances, jaywalking, pedestrian in the motorway. There was a trans woman that was held in the Fulton County Jail for 6 months on jaywalking. So we see that, one, we need to focus on what are those correctional institutions that hold people that are not dangerous to the public, that are not holding people that actually commit heinous crimes. And then also for the local jails, like the county jail, which may be a more difficult facility to completely close in its entirety, how do we depopulate those institutions, right? And then again, redirecting those monies back into community. I'll give you one example. Fulton County commissioners were about to spend $23 million in COVID relief money from the federal government to expand our county jail by 120 beds. I thought that was unbelievable that someone would come up with the way to provide relief and recovery to community is building more jails. So we took 150 protesters down there to the county commissioner's office and we said, absolutely not. And they came downstairs and they heard that righteous outrage of the people and the anger, and they went upstairs and they decided to kill that proposal and never bring it back again. Now we need to figure out through a participatory budgeting process, how does that money get back into the hands of the people so that way they see that when we redirect dollars from correctional institutions, that they can actually have a real impact on the quality of life in your community. And so I believe it starts from the local level. Jails and local jails are the entry point into the prison industrial complex. If we stifle and demolish, decommission and depopulate jails at the local level, then we stop one of the main entry points for the prison industrial complex. So I believe it starts with our jails at the local level.
It all starts with us, and I think we all have to start paying a little bit closer attention. Professor Vitale said it as well. It's the local level. Devin is talking about commissioners. You can't just vote. You've got to vote, and then you've got to hold those representatives accountable.
You have to show up. Politicians are like children. If you leave them to their own devices, they will be disruptive. And so I remember my mom told me years ago, when I send you up to that schoolhouse, I expect for you to do work. And if I've got to come up there to the school, that's fine. And so that's how I deal with the elected officials. I was a candidate for office as well. If folks have to come up there and hold you accountable, that's a part of the job. You can't just, it's not set it and forget it in the ways with our local government. You have to show up.
You have to show up. You have to hold folks accountable. I think I've gotten to all of the questions. We've commented on everything that was in the chat, but we've got about 2 minutes if anyone has another question. And if any of our panelists want to provide reading materials or any other materials that people might want to consider in this discussion. Jesse, or I know I've been talking about Professor Vitale's In Policing book, but does anyone else have anything for folks?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I would just say that you can check out our website. We have an entire portfolio that is very specifically police reform. If you're interested in other areas of the criminal justice system, we've talked about bail and jail reform, prosecutorial reform. We have those portfolios as well. Just go to rstreet.org. So the letter R, street.org. And then I'm on Twitter at Jess D. Kelley.
I put in the chat, thank you all for this opportunity. First, again, a reminder, there is active demands right now that you can champion and call your city council member and harass around defunding the police here in Atlanta, dismantling our police department, and reimagining public safety. I put the Black Futurist Group website in the chat. And so feel free to go there. At the top navigation bar, you will see our demands around defunding APD. Feel free to read them, study up on them, and call your council members about it. You can reach out to me personally through the Black Futurist Group website, and I'm also not as big on Twitter, but I am there on Twitter, Devin Barrington-Ward. And if you really want to connect with me, Instagram and Facebook is the best place, Devin Barrington-Ward. I'm excited around the possibilities of partnership with my panelists, particularly Professor. I think the book, I know I'll be ordering the book as well, and I'd love to have some conversations with you offline. And thank you so much for moderating our conversation. I listen to you on Saturdays.
Thank you for listening.
Of course.
I'll definitely be in touch, Devin, and people can follow me on Twitter at @Vitale, and they can learn more about the work of the Policing and Social Justice Project at policingandjustice.org. And the book is available as an ebook directly from the publisher, versobooks.com, for only $3.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. I've learned quite a bit, and I'm so excited that I was asked to participate, and I hope all of our attendees have at least learned one new thing today about this new challenge to reimagine public safety. I'm going to start saying reimagine public safety, since defund the police has such a negative connotation. But thank you guys so much for taking the time to spend and share this knowledge with our community as we are struggling to face these challenges and issues on what policing in the future looks like. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kiplyn Primus, for moderating today. Jesse Kelley, Professor Vitale, Devin, this was absolutely amazing. We were sending messages back and forth from people from the center, and we were just absolutely enthralled with what was being said. So we appreciate how informative it was and the different perspectives and different areas that were talked about. So thank you again so much for being here. We truly appreciate it. And just to keep everyone in the loop of what's going on next at the center, we have our campaign for equal dignity happening. So check out the website. You can sign our pledge, and we also have a feature now where you can write to your representatives to start asking for change. We're also partnering with Equitable Dinners. The next one coming up is July 19th, so definitely check that out. Also, we have another webinar coming up on June 29th. It's part of our Health and Human Rights series, and this one is addressing homelessness and mental health. Also, one of our Power to Inspire recipients, we're still trying to get a strong date for this program, so stay with us as we get that in the works. And thank you all so much for joining us. Again, to our moderator and our panelists, I personally cannot thank you enough for your time, as well as the voices that you have put into this movement and continue to do. So thank you so much, and we wish everyone a happy weekend. Thank you, everybody.